Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. The poppies have pretty much finished flowering here in the Jewel Garden, but I want to leave them in because the seed heads that follow the flowers are absolutely beautiful. They make this lovely sculptural shape. But unfortunately, the foliage does not die well. It becomes a brown, raggedy mess. So the answer is just to strip them off, and it's really easy. Just run your hands down the stem, leaving the stem clean, topped by this lovely piece of sculpture. And of course, around them, the Jewel Garden is still bursting into colour. The clematis, these are the late-flowering Viticella clematis, are really coming into their own. And they are spreading out these towers of flower all around the Jewel Garden. And they will go on flowering right into autumn. On today's programme, Adam goes to historic Brodsworth Hall in Yorkshire to meet a head gardener brilliantly preserving the past.
He's telling the story, the historic side of gardens and keeping that alive. And, you know, in 150 years' time, people will look in what myself and the current garden team have been doing.
We take a trip to Malden in Essex, to an old farmyard where they are continually experimenting with dramatic floral displays.
In May, we do something completely doolally. We rip out all the tulips and we start planting these beds.
And I shall be explaining the difference between summer and winter pruning. We haven't paid many visits to the damp garden this year. Now, the pond itself, left alone, will be happy. It's whether you, the gardener, like what it's doing. And as far as I'm concerned, I think I'm more interested in the wildlife than I am in perfectly grown water lilies, for example. But the two are not mutually incompatible. So what I'm going to do is a little bit of sorting out, and that's where I'm clutching a wire rake. Because the easiest way to clean your pond is gently rake the surface. And what that will do is pick up the algae and the blanket weed if you've got it. And you can just scoop them up like that. Now, the important thing to do is not put them into a trug or a wheelbarrow straight away, but put them on the edge of the pond, because in there will be a whole myriad of little creatures. And if we put them just down on the edge, down like that, they will make their way back into the water over the next 24 hours. However, you have to get in there and do a little bit of weeding too, so that's what I'm going to do now. What we have here are two types of water lily. These are the nymphea, and this is a miniature form. And this is a nufa, which is a pond lily. Now, these are much more vigorous, and certainly I will have to thin and divide them. And a good way of knowing when a water lily or a pond lily has got too big is when the leaves cease to be flat on the surface of the water and start to rise up. And that patch at the back has become congested. Now, I've missed the boat on the best time to thin them, because really, ideally, it should be done in May and certainly no later than the end of June. Now, the Iris pseudochorus, the native flag iris, which looks wonderful with these bright yellow, beautiful flowers in spring, is a thug. And you can see it's just beginning to spread out to the middle. So I'm going to pull these up and take them out. The rhizomes are really quite solid and they spread out. And pull that apart. There we go. That's it. That's come. Okay, that can go there. Now, whilst I've taken out many of these flag irises. I certainly want to leave a lot in. Now, I make no claims to being an expert on aquatic plants. For that, you do need to go to a specialist nursery. So that's where we went.
It was irises that drew me to water gardening, really, because I've always had a love of irises. I just think they're so elegant and beautiful. It's all the sort of intricate veining on the falls, just find that really fascinating. There's something about being around water that's just really calming, and having that in your garden just seems to bring a whole new feel to it. It's kind of opened up a whole new area for me, and it is really different to work with pond plants than it is to work with garden plants. I'm Emma Robertson. Myself and my husband Tom are based on the edge of Dartmoor National Park. We're 1,100 feet high, so we do get some quite extreme weather, and it rains a lot, and everything's very green and very lush, and that's why it's perfect for pond plants. So when designing a pond and building a pond, it's important to have different levels so that you can have a good range of plants. So for a deep water area, we've got things like newfars and water lilies. They like to be pretty deep in the pond itself, and they send up the leaves to the surface. They often don't get established and get going until midsummer, and then they start flowering late summertime into autumn. But they have these fantastic leaves which are really good for wildlife to take cover underneath as well and shelter. And they also give a little bit of shade from the full sun as well. So as well as the deep water plants, you then also have marginal plants, and this is often built into a pond with a shelf, which is normally about 20 centimetres deep, and that suits most marginal plants. You've got irises, lots of different water irises. There's rushes and reeds like the Scirpus zabrinus here, and then other marginals as well that may need to be a little bit more shallow, so they might want putting on a rock or just raising up a little bit so that the water's just covering the top of the pot. Things like the cotula, golden buttons, water mints, bog bean, which will just sort of come out and spread onto the surface. Oxygenators are really plants that help to filter the water, oxygenate it and keep it clear. So they take out the extra nitrates and nutrients that stop things like algae and blanket weed growing. There's things like the native hornwort, which floats in the ponds. They normally advise oxygenators for 1 bunch per metre squared. They can also grow rapidly, so they can take over. And that again is important to then take some out, otherwise it can be detrimental. But also, perfect plants for oxygenating are things like the iris here and pontidaria for late season colour. Excellent at filtering water because they grow rapidly, they take in those extra nutrients, and if you've got a good balance of plants in the pond, you don't always need the oxygenator. Weeding is important too, and ponds do get weedy just as gardens do. And when you've got 8 ponds in an acre site to manage, it's really difficult. It's a lot of manpower. So we decided to hire in an elite team of weeding ducks, which worked out really well. They completely cleared the space of duckweed and blanket weed, and they keep the ponds nice and clean, which is fantastic. The only downside is they do like to nibble on certain marginal plants, so we have to keep them separate. But in terms of the ponds with the irises, they do a work of like 10 men. They're pretty easy to manage, and you get free eggs as well, which is always a bonus. It's important to get the right plant for the right size pond. For example, Iris pseudochorus can be quite vigorous and take over, whereas other iris like Iris lavigata and versicolor are a lot more suited to typical garden ponds. But if you don't have much room in your garden, you can simply do something with a container like this. This is what we call a mini pond, and I like to add a few rocks in there. But this is also really good for wildlife because it means that things can get in and out, like frogs or hedgehogs can have a drink. So stick a few of those in. It just helps raise the pot up a little bit. And then you've got a selection of marginal plants that's suitable for containers. So this is Juncus spiralis, which is a spiral rush or a corkscrew rush because it does this twirly thing with its foliage and sort of stays evergreen most of the year. And we would use a topsoil mixed with gravel to pot it up. So half fill the pot and then backfill around the pot. And then if we put a little top dressing of stones on top, it just keeps the soil from leaching out, like so. And then we would place that in so the pot is just below the water surface like that. So that's one. The next plant I would use is something like a chorus. It's got lovely golden foliage. And again, would just pot that up into a little pot. These pots are made from recycled plastic bottles and they're perfect for this size of pond. Again, a little top dressing of gravel. And again, that would just be positioned just below the water surface like that. So that's two. You could then use something like a mini water lily. So even water lilies come in all different sizes. And this one is a pygmy water lily, which is suitable for a container. And then this can go on the deepest bit. So you place that in slowly, let it submerge slowly so that everything doesn't just pour out and cloud the water. And then I think one more that we could use is the Sagittaria, which has a little white flower sort of late summer, so you've got a bit of interest all season. And then again, position that so that it's just sitting under the water surface, like that. And there you have a little mini pond in a pot. I tend to leave the dividing to Tom because he doesn't need an excuse to get in the pond. It's good to split and divide the pond plants every sort of 3 to 5 years because you've got a certain space and plants grow and get bigger. So you need to then rejuvenate them, split and divide, repot and put them back in, which means you'll get better flowers as well.
It looks quite brutal, but it's not. And out of that one clump we took out, we've got 8 new plants.
I knew I always would like to run a nursery eventually. Pond plants and water irises was never part of that, but at the end of the day, it's my back garden. So yeah, it's pretty special.
I do like the idea of having ducks in the garden, weeding around the pond and eating slugs. Now, I know a lot of people feel a little bit anxious about how best and when to prune, particularly when it comes to fruit. Now, when you cut is really influential. So we have summer pruning, which you do now, and winter pruning, which you do in the winter months in December, January and February. And the result on the same plant will be very different. So this apple tree, which is called Glory of England and has an enormous apple, was one that I pruned hard a couple of years ago in winter. Now, the result has been a rash of whippy new shoots at each pruning point, because summer pruning tends to hold growth back, whereas winter pruning promotes it. And you can see that in hedge cutting. We cut our hedges in summer and they stay trim. The growth is slowed right down. And with summer pruning that slows growth down, restricts it, winter pruning that promotes growth, if you use both, you can really get some good effects with fruit. That's when it comes into its own. So I've got gooseberries here growing as cordons. But in a small space, you can get masses of gooseberries from them. The same with apples and pears and espaliers, stepovers, fans. These are all trained fruit that rely upon summer pruning to keep their shape. So these are all cordon apples. Cordons are the single stem, and they're nearly always grown at 45 degrees because that marries two growth characteristics of fruit trees. The first is its vigor, which is much more powerful when it's growing simply vertically. And you can see that that leader is growing absolutely straight up, but fruit forms better on a horizontal growth. So we're combining maximum vigor with maximum fruitfulness by going halfway between the two. But you can also see that there's most growth at the top of the plant, and it's shading out the light from the bottom. So what I'm going to do now, and this is the summer pruning, so it needs to be done now, is cut back all the new growth, and with any pruning, always cut to something, either a leaf or another shoot or fruit. So we'll just cut above that. Now, apples and pears and gooseberries and red currants mainly form their fruit on spurs. Now, spurs grow on side shoots, and they're little swollen bits of stem and bark with a knobbly growth off it. So I don't want to cut that off because that may well bear fruit next year, but I'll cut just above it there. And even if there isn't a spur yet, you can see here, for example, a swelling on the end of the old growth, and that's where a spur will form. So I'll just cut above it there. There. And there. If in doubt, just cut off the new growth. One of the great advantages of training fruit in this way is you can have interesting, fresh, seasonal fruit, however small your garden is. But that doesn't match up to this film sent to us from Sam in Manchester, who not only has fruit in his garden, he's got his own woodland.
My name's Sam. I live in Old Trafford in Manchester. I have been inspired by many of the videos, viewers sending in shots of their own garden and their own gardening, and I thought I would share with you the quite recent transformation that we've tried to achieve in our very small space. It's a very dark corner of the garden, so you can see we've got lots of shade-tolerant plants, hostas, ferns, and then as we come back through the yard, we can see our most recent planter with the clematis I've just planted. And our sunny corner where we've got some herbs, rosemary and thyme, sage. And then this is the woodland corridor with a slightly squiffy damson tree and other shade-tolerant plants. We've got lots of ferns and vinca and a hawthorn in there. So it's like a real little woodland. My day job, I research green spaces and urban green spaces. So it was really important for me to find ways to bring wildlife into the garden, even pigeons. And we've just started to attract some garden birds to our little yard. It's been a real surprise and excitement because it's taken a long time to encourage them. So I hope you've enjoyed looking around my little yard in Old Trafford. I've enjoyed showing it to you, and good luck with your own wildlife gardening.
I like what Sam is doing with his garden, and I think to include damson and hawthorn into a small urban space like that is really enlightened, because after all, those are trees of the countryside, and certainly no garden is too small to attract wildlife. And it's funny where they go, because even here in the Paradise Garden, which after all is certainly not intended to be a wildlife garden, it's completely decorative, the crab apples, which for the moment are just anonymous little green berries, but by autumn they will have swollen and become this lovely orangey red, and the blackbirds fall on them. They absolutely love them. And I would say if you've got a small garden and you want a tree, think about a crabapple. There are lots to choose from. Some are very small, some grow larger, but they all have really good blossom. They tend to have good shapes, are easy to prune if you want to prune them, and of course then have the beautiful crab apples, which are decorative, good for you to eat, and the birds adore them. And if you want to attract wildlife into your garden, and increasingly most of us do, the key thing is you've got to abandon trying to control every aspect of your garden, and that will allow wildlife in. But this is a very modern attitude. If you go back to the Victorian era, it was completely different. Everything then was about control, keeping nature firmly under the gardener's control, and the garden looked and reflected that attitude. And Adam has been to Brodsworth Hall, just outside Doncaster, which is perhaps the best preserved Victorian garden in the country.
Brodsworth Hall near Doncaster is Victorian gardening at its best. The 20 acres are an altar to the gods of bedding plants and precision, all being restored to their former 19th century glory. It takes me back to being 16 years old and North Devon Parks Department.
This is how I cut my teeth looking after schemes like this, so I understand how much hard work and dedication it takes to have something looking this beautiful. But I also know the head gardener here doesn't just care about the history, he also wants to inform the future.
Dan Hale has been head gardener at Brodsworth Hall for 5 years. He's young. He got the job just aged 27, but he was already in love with the history.
So, mate, you trained initially as a landscaper, but tell me how you got into historic gardens.
So it first started, so it was actually my grandma who saw the advert. I think it was when first walking into the garden and kind of fully understanding the importance of gardeners, you know, in the Georgian, Victorian, into the Edwardian era. You know, seeing the pictures of them walking round in the tweed and learning the history and, you know, looking through the archives, you know, the introduction dates of the trees and plants that were being brought in at the time and things like that. So fully understanding not just horticulture, but the history behind it.
Brodsworth Hall was built in the 1860s by the Tellison family, who loved Tuscany. As a result, more than 1,000 topiary trees and shrubs flank the house. There's symmetrical lawns and pristine beds, a fern garden, a rose garden, and a target garden used for archery. Brodsworth was given to English Heritage, and they were restoring it when Dan arrived. But he chose an unlikely first project.
So this area was just completely overgrown with ivy.
Was it?
And at the end of this pile of ivy was this 8-foot section of ivy. So obviously, you know, quite intriguing as you're walking past. And luckily for me, I was there with the head of gardens and the gardens advisor and just kind of said, "What is this?" And so we think it's the old privy. So off I jotted in here, got the secateurs out, started cutting away and started to unveil this amazing, quirky little building underneath.
A battered trellis, window and sculpted zinc roof were discovered under a cloud of leaves. Now, the privy and the surrounding garden are beautiful.
So this would have all been planted, wouldn't it, with scented planting, maybe just to sort of hide maybe the smells that weren't quite so nice?
Everything would have been around kind of masking any scent that were coming away from the privy. So down to the blush noisette on the trellising.
It was designed for the family and guests, so they didn't need to go back to the house. And it's sunken out of sight, surrounded by garden.
It's all right if I can see what the view's like.
Check it out, it's your throne.
Dan, I tell you what, mate, the view, it's incredible, isn't it? Could definitely waste a few minutes here.
It's great, I mean, it's the loo with a view.
Lovely.
The Victorians loved symmetry and precision. The ranks of bedding in the flower garden were all the rage. Set in pinpoint sharp beds, Brodsworth had 24 gardeners at its height. Now there's 6 and dozens of volunteers who replant the garden twice a year.
So, Dan, how many plants are in here, mate?
Round about 22 to 24,000 bedding plants,
Yeah.
but actually then you've got your inclusion of your bulbs in there as well.
The Tellison family loved archery, and this target garden is a long lawn for shooting practice, built in a quarry. But alongside the range, Dan uncovered more magic.
So Dan, when you arrived, what did the actual area look like?
So when I started, this area was just grass, just turf, basically. I always knew that the stonework was under there. We got some of the millstones that were kind of popping up out of the ground, so it always made it a little bit awkward for the guys when we were mowing, you know, trying to avoid the stones.
They cleared the grass and found a network of paths underneath.
We could see that this stonework was actually the original Georgian roof slates. And you can actually see on some of the big pieces still some of the old oak pegs that they would have used to actually peg it in and you know, seal it onto the old roof.
Looking back at the archives, he recreated the beds to their original block planting. Designed to smell great from the ground and look like a mosaic from above. So what makes Dan keep up this push and precision?
I think there's many factors that kind of drive me in horticulture, to be honest, but it's, you know, it's telling the story, the historic side of gardens and keeping that alive. And just as we have researched, you know, gardeners of the past, mainly focusing on the 1860s like we do here, you know, in 150 years' time, people will be looking what myself and the current garden team have been doing.
The quarry that the target garden sits in provides the backdrop for another hidden and surprising garden.
Wow, I seriously wasn't expecting that.
Well, that's the reaction we're after.
This is the ferndale, built in tiers to show off plants from above and below. Much of the new fern collection was donated, and keeping shade-loving plants happy here now is not easy.
I mean, the challenges mainly in this area is the sun.
Yeah.
You know, over time, due to wind and other factors, we have lost some of the tree canopy in this zone. So we have obviously replanted the fagus on both sides
just to try
of the quarry to combat that.
I'm not sure you and I will be here though, mate.
No, exactly, exactly, yes.
So, in the meantime, they've got Trachycarpus and Cercis, bringing quick growth to protect the collection. This is a thoroughly inspiring garden.
I've been a bit blown away. I think I knew partly what to expect. There is a real sense of Victorian times about it.
Well, that's great to hear because that is exactly what we're trying to create.
Yeah, which is a compliment to you and the team. Really incredible.
And I think we all feel proud to work here, and I think that comes across in the work.
I think you should do. You should do. It's really beautiful.
I do like to see a fernery. I've seen quite a few, and they were very common and popular in Victorian times. But of course, to get the full effect, they need to be dark, dank, shady places, all of which appealed to the Victorian love of Gothic. I've come here to take out the broad beans. There's times when you just have to cut your losses in the vegetable garden. It's not producing any more flowers, so there'll be no more beans. And the beans that are on here can only get more leathery and more flowery, so time for them to go. Now, I could pick them now and then pull up the plants, or, as we usually do, is pull up the plants, take the whole thing to the kitchen, pick off the beans, and then go to the compost heap, and that's what I'm going to do. Now, don't be fooled by the amount of root you're pulling up, because you are leaving behind much, much more in the soil. In fact, broad bean roots can go down as deep as 8 feet. The other thing about these roots is that they have these little white nodules. Those are nitrogen-fixing nodules, and what legumes do is take nitrogen from the air and trap it, and they fix it via these nodules into the soil. Now, obviously, they will use up quite a lot of that nitrogen, but they will also leave the nodules in the ground and make extra nitrogen available to a subsequent crop. Now, nitrogen is what makes plants green and leafy, which is why in the rotation of a vegetable garden, you follow legumes with a leaf crop rather than a root crop. If you sow carrots or parsnips, all you'll get is lots of top growth and not very good roots. So I'm going to pull these out and then put a leafy crop afterwards. Now usually that's a brassica of some kind, although it could just as easily be chard or spinach or even lettuce. Right, still to come on today's programme. We visit a garden where they never stop experimenting on how best to create their late summer displays.
We put the high, tall structural plants that give us all the height that we need. Then we start doing the more sort of feminine side of things where we start working out where the colour combinations are going to be.
And I will be harvesting my potatoes. But first, we're going to look at one of your gardens. And Thomas and Zoe has sent us this film from their garden in London.
I'm Thomas.
I'm Zoe. Welcome to our garden.
Welcome to our garden.
When we first moved in, this garden was mainly covered by evergreen shrubs, but we love colors. So over the years, gradually we added more and more flowering plants. Now you can see the result. Ta-da! We have 13 roses in our garden. We did have some difficulty at the beginning. First plant we bought was of medium disease resistance, so it doesn't look very healthy. But ever after that, all the roses we bought are with high resistance to pests and disease. Also, at the beginning of April, we bought lots of ladybugs and introduced them to our garden. Very quickly after we released them into the garden, they start their job straight away. The other strategy we adopt is to add more insect-friendly flowers and plants into the garden. At last, do remember to deadhead the spent flowers. It will encourage more flowers to come out, and the flower season will last longer. It is so peaceful and quiet in our garden, and I can sit here all day long. It provided a sanctuary for us during the lockdown. Our garden has brought us so much enjoyment and fun.
We hope yours does the same to you. Thank you for watching.
Bye!
There's no doubt about it that roses do vary hugely in the way that they respond to predation, to disease, to weather, to soil, and you have to choose your roses accordingly. One of my favourite roses is Souvenir de Malmaison, which I've got in this garden, but it always gets black spot. And the truth is, I shouldn't really grow it here. Whereas something like a rugosa rose, or the albas, or the modern roses are much tougher. So it is worth choosing the right rose that will give you the colour and the fragrance you want, but also be good and hardy. Now, this is the last pot of the season to be planted, and its centrepiece is a climber. It's called Cobea scandens, the cup and saucer plant, and I've grown these from seed for the last few years. They grow very easily from seed. I've got one here. The key thing to know about Cobea is that it produces its large saucer-shaped flowers late. It doesn't start flowering in this garden until August or even September, but goes on flowering until the first frost. And you can get them in white and shades of ivory, but this is much more normal mauvish colour. So we're going to put that as a centrepiece. Right, I'm just going to tie that in. Kabir is a tender plant, so this won't survive the frost, but it does grow really quite vigorously. So it would easily outgrow this support. So if you want to plant it outside, give it a big support and it will clamber up all over it. But it's very easy to prune it back and it'll be quite happy on here. It really responds well to quite rich soil. So add a bit of goodness to your peat-free compost and keep it well watered. Now, I'm not just going to grow Kabir, I want to pack around it. So I'm going to start with a fuchsia. This is a fuchsia called Annabelle. It's white, creamy colour, flushed with this touch of pink. So I'm going to put 4 of these in here. And the idea is that they spill out over the edge of the pot. If you're planting a pot like this, it's not a bad idea just to place them before you actually put them in the soil. And you can see the way I've done that is by not filling the pot up too full. So I can just sit them on the surface of the compost and then I will place compost around them when I'm happy. Right, let's have that a little bit over. Next up, I've got helichrysum. Now, helichrysum used to be really popular, used in pots as an absolute stock plant, this lovely grey foliage spilling out and growing freely. You don't see it so much now, which is a real shame because it's a good one and very easy to grow, very tolerant of almost any position and any soil. In fact, I can plant it a little bit away from the edge because when this grows, it doesn't just spill out, it actually has a little bit of volume. So you don't need to push it up against the side of the pot. Now, I've got one of my favourite plants, which is this. This is prostrate or trailing rosemary. Given the right conditions, it spills and sprawls with lovely clear blue flowers in spring, this rich green foliage, and then the very, very pale green stems, and of course that fantastic fragrance. And this is a herb garden, so this is a nod to the herbs, and this also should spill and sprawl both around the base of the cobia and up over the sides. I'm going to put 3 in. Now, I have to admit that these are plants that aren't, strictly speaking, compatible. If this wasn't a pot, I wouldn't plant them together. So, for example, fuchsias do best in slightly moist conditions, moist air, cool. Rosemary does best in full sunshine, poor soil, and doesn't need too much water. But for a late season pot, doesn't matter. They'll both be fine until October, November, when the whole thing will be deconstructed anyway. Now, I'm going to plant these and then I'm going to add a little bit of colour. Now, the final touch I'm adding is a plant I've never grown before. This is Scovola. And it hasn't been around for very long, but it's got these mauve bluish flowers. Now, this is a sprawler, but it's more upright. So it's not going to compete with the helichrysum or the rosemary or the fuchsia, but it will just fill this lower area with both colour and leaf. Like that. The great thing about pots, whether it's a big one like this or a small one, is any garden, anywhere can use them. They can transform an existing garden or even make a garden if all you've got is a small bit of paved area. Of course, this will have to be watered in and kept well watered for the rest of the summer. And I'll feed this with a liquid seaweed once a week too. And I think that we have the balance here between something that is subtle enough to be pleasing, but not boring. I think this will look really good. The writing garden is looking pretty good, but the best thing of all, the thing I love, is that rose sprawling and frothing through the apple tree. And it doesn't flower for very long, maybe a couple of weeks at the most, but for those 2 weeks, it's just magical. The apple tree, by the way, which is a Worcester pomain, still produces apples. But quite frankly, even if it just acted as a support for the rose for 2 wonderful weeks a year, then it's worth its place. Now, by the way, I wanted just to show you, do you remember that I had a couple of hydrangeas here in the writing garden that were absolutely blasted in all the frosts that we had in April? They were blackened and the leaves shriveled and it looked as though they would never recover. Well, here it is. Look, there you are. I told you it was going to be okay. And it's perfectly fine. Flowers are forming. There's another one on the other side that is just as well. So if you have a hydrangea that gets touched by frost and reduced to black rags in spring, hang on, it will come back. Now, we went to Altingwick in Essex, where they use colour with real drama and panache right through the seasons.
I'm Philippa Burrough, and I've lived at Altingwick for 25 years. When I first arrived here, I didn't have much experience of gardening, but what I was aware of is I had the potential for a wonderful backdrop. We've got an 18th century and a 17th century barn, and they are varnished in black tar. In the spring, the old farmyard is actually full of tulips, and we grow the tulips in sort of rather odd swirly patterns, and we plant about 5,000 a year in this particular area alone, and another 5,000 throughout the rest of the garden. I really love that early splash of colour. You get that diversity of colour. It's really the start of the gardening year. And the black barns, just when you have those lovely pinks and oranges with the light, it just shine out and it gives you sort of hope for the rest of the gardening year. But in May, we do something completely doolally. We rip out all the tulips and we start planting these beds. We put the high, tall structural plants that give us all the height that we need. Then we start doing the more sort of feminine side of things where we start working out where the colour combinations are going to be with the dahlias, which give that lovely blast of colour. We rip out the tulips because it gives us the opportunity to do a wonderful display. We've got wonderful Canna musifolia, not grown for its flowers, unlike most cannas, it's just grown for its architectural leaves. And then we've got some ricinus, that lovely purple with orange is just wonderful. And then one of my all-time favourite plants, which I do use a lot in the garden, is this, which is this Perilla purple seashow, and this is the one with a wonderful iridescence. It's a Japanese culinary herb, but I actually don't use it in a culinary sense. I use it for its wonderful leaf form, and look at those wonderful ribs you have on there. And then the colours in the veins. It's like a lower structure from the ricinus, bouncing the colours across. A friend of mine described this garden as a laboratory garden. In other words, we're happy to experiment and change and try different things each year. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's just a garden that changes. I'm going to show you one of my more successful laboratory experiments for this year. So, round the corner here, we have this amazing plant. It looks very prehistoric. It's actually a Eupatorium capillifolium, and I just love the texture of this. It'll probably move next year. It might end up over there at the back of one of the borders. And I think it would look probably quite nice with maybe some cosmos coming through it next year, because the cosmos foliage will pick up this sort of furry side of this. But we'll see. Who knows what will happen next year. And here we have the centre area of the old farmyard. So this year we've actually planted the Aeonium Schwarzkopf into the ground, and they're very happy here and got really large rosettes on them now. And then just to hide the bare stems, because they're not the most attractive things, the stems, we've put this very dainty and rather beautiful lime green, good contrast with the black. It's the Euphorbia Diamond Frost. I'm always a bit of a sucker for really unusual plants, and in here we've got one of my, well, sort of showstoppers. It's called Lepochina hastata, and has these long purple spikes. Not all my experiments work, unfortunately, and we've got a good example over here. Wonderful Miscanthus nepalensis is just coming out. It's hidden at the back there. It should be much further forward and enjoy in its own right and as a sort of statement as opposed to being tucked in the back. But next year we'll get it right. We'll move it and hopefully it'll be centre stage somewhere. It's just fun to experiment. You can do all this in a season and then at the end of the season you take it all out and then we start planting the tulips again. And it's incredible when you see it and it's first planted in June and it's all down there and by the end of the year it's way up there. It's just great. Oh, it's a tremendous amount of work, but then I've never been scared of hard work. One of my favourite areas in the garden is the pink garden, which is full of tulips in the spring, but is actually really designed as a late summer garden. And it's full of asters and dahlias and grasses. And then that leads down into the white garden, which has a completely different feel. It's much more reflective and calm and cool, and it's full of cosmos and persicaria alba, and it's quiet and contemplative and small and intimate. It's just a sort of breathing space after the sort of somewhat manic, over-the-top colour that goes on in the farmyard. Obviously, although colour looks great against black, we've got these wonderful white plants that look great against the black of the cottage. I've got a pot display outside the front door, and like everything else in this garden, it needs a little bit of editing and a little bit of maintenance from time to time. Right, so what I'm doing now is just tinkering with the pot display. I really love having arrangements outside the front door. And the whole idea is to mirror that sort of exuberance and that wow factor that you can get from using different plants. So I've just got this little one here I've taken out there. It's a little beautiful little begonia shepardii, and I think it'll look quite nice down here if we just see if that works down there. I'm going to just shove this dahlia that's really got very large back in. Move that. I'm just going to bring the caladium forward a little bit because that's now got lost, and look at it now, it's zinging lots more with the dahlia. And then we'll try that one there, a little collection of begonias, and maybe that one there. And then I think this one can probably go back in just this little space that we've got here. Change is always good. It keeps everything fresh and brings out the best in plants. Can't use the front door. But that doesn't matter, we've got a back door. As we all know, you never stop learning as a gardener, and I hope, the next however many years I've got here, I will be still buying new plants and still experimenting and learning. It's life-affirming.
I do so agree with the need to experiment, to try things out, even play a bit in the garden. Now, if you want to go to Altingwick and get inspiration for your own garden, you can, because it's open under the National Garden Scheme, and if you go to our website, you'll get the details of opening hours and dates. Now, something that I've stopped experimenting with, because I know I like it and it works, is growing first or second early potatoes that I can harvest in July. And I often grow the same variety, which is Charlotte, which is a second early. And second early potatoes sort of fall between the gap of new potatoes and main crop. They ripen in about 90 days, whereas earlies are about 80 days and main crop about 100. Now, you can see that the foliage is looking pretty tragic. This has happened over the last week or so. And what it does mean is that they're not going to go on growing anymore, and it's high time that they were harvested. And when you're growing potatoes, it's good to focus the watering. The time to water potatoes is when they come into flower. Don't harvest them before then. When you see the flowers, give them a really good soak, and that will swell out the tubers. And then really from any time after that, you can harvest them. As soon as you start to see the foliage die down like this, it's a good idea to dig them up if they're first or second earlies. But main crop can stay in the ground for months if need be. I planted these not in ridges or rows, but just simply by making a hole with a trowel and popping them in the ground in a grid fairly close together. Now with potatoes, the further apart they are, the bigger the potatoes will be. And I would expect quite a few quite small potatoes as a result. And now I will begin to very gently dig them up, because the fewer that I can spike, the better. These are a good size. This is exactly the size that I would want from this variety of potato. And you can eat them straight out the ground, or you can store them for maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 months in the right conditions. Whereas main crop, you can store right through till next summer. Now, there's some green on that tuber, and that means it's been exposed to light, which is one of the reasons you earth potatoes up. And when the tuber is exposed to light, it reacts and it creates a toxin. So do not eat the green part of a potato. Cut it off and put it in the compost heap. I'm going to take my time over this and try and do it as carefully as possible. But it's a chance to visit another of your gardens. And we've been sent a film from a community living together with lots and lots of experience, which they pool to make a garden.
Hello, my name's Cheryl. Welcome to our woodland garden here in the retirement building that I live in now in Malvern, a lovely part of the world. I've always loved plants and gardening all my life. This used to be an area that was overgrown and quite untidy. I got a group of volunteers together from here, our residents, and we all had a go at developing this into our lovely wooden garden. We started it about 3 years ago now. It's been delightful through the spring with all the narcissi, erythroniums, dodecathions, anything you could think of, we've probably got it growing. Lots of lovely ferns. Peonies, which are flowered for the first time, this yellow one over here. Also, we have our water feature. When it's going, it produces a lovely sound and has that feeling of serenity and calmness. Is our tree fern, which we're so pleased with. We've been looking after it for 3 years, putting it in the potting shed in the winter, covered in fleece, and we're so pleased that every time we come along, it hasn't caught the frost. It's a delight for all the residents living here. We get enormous pleasure from it, which is it should be, and I hope you've enjoyed looking at our woodland garden. Thank you.
Malvern is not so far from here. It's nice to see what a garden can mean to people, how important they are. It doesn't matter where they are, who they're for, they really matter. Now, I've soaked this seed tray and compost before sowing it. Put it in a tray of water and leave it for half an hour or so. It will soak up the water, and particularly when your compost is very dry. It's a good way of doing it, because otherwise the water tends to just bounce off and certainly can disturb the seeds. And I'm sowing some spinach. And now's a really good time to sow spinach, because spinach grows best in slightly cooler weather. In hot, particularly dry weather, it tends to bolt, and that means it quickly just goes to seed. So if I sow the seed now, and you can sow this direct if you've got a spare bit of ground, these will germinate in about 5 to 10 days. They'll be ready for pricking out in about 2-3 weeks' time, and for planting out in about 6 weeks' time, which takes us round about to the middle of September, when it is distinctly cooler. And that will give us lovely spinach right through autumn into Christmas. I'm just going to cover it over lightly to stop light getting through to it, and that will help germination. That'll do. I need to label it. This is called trombone, and this is particularly good because it's very slow to bolt. So I will put that into the greenhouse. It doesn't actually need much heat to germinate. A windowsill will do fine, or a porch, or even somewhere sheltered outside. Okay, that's a small job. Here are some other jobs for you this weekend. Species roses, like this Rosa pimpernellifolia, have mostly finished flowering by now, so this is the time to prune them. That's because they produce their flowers on the shoots that were created the previous summer. So only prune the oldest growth, and when you do so, go right down to the ground or to the lowest side shoot. This will let light and air into the plant, encourage new growth, and ensure a dramatic display next summer. Onion and shallot sets should be ready to lift now. And you'll know the time when the top growth is starting to die back. Don't just yank them out the ground, but carefully lift them with a fork, being sure not to damage the roots where they join the bulb. Then place them somewhere warm, sunny and dry so that all the foliage can completely die back, and then they'll be ready to store. At this time of year, when we can have warm, wet weather, shady paths can be very slippery indeed and dangerous. And we've found at Longmeadow the best way of dealing with this is to use sharp sand, which you can buy from any builder's merchant, sprinkle it on the path and scrub it hard with a firm bristled brush. It is quite hard work, but it's very effective. Topiary Nigel, he's looking quite trim, the old boy. He's not looking too bad. And over the coming weeks, it's a good time to start trimming evergreen topiary and hedges. And obviously, before you start any hedge cutting, just double check that there are no young birds in the nest. And if there are, back off. Most of them will fledge and leave by the end of July, but just keep a lookout. But certainly, Nigel is not harbouring any birds, but he has got the yellow ball. Nell, you see Nigel's got the ball? That's what she's been wanting to do all along. Right, that's it for today. And next Friday is the first night of the proms. So to accommodate that, we are going out at the earlier hour of 7 o'clock. So I'll see you back here at Longmeadow at 7 next Friday. Till then, bye-bye.